Mr. Chomsky, I'm just wondering if you would like to share some of your views on the recent changes taking place in Latin America.
That's very interesting and important.
Thank you.
And very much related to the Middle East, incidentally. Remember, the U.S. is a global power, so you can't just look at one region. You have to look at what's going on everywhere. So if we go back, say, to the last intelligence projection of the Clinton administration, National Intelligence Council, year 2000, their projection for the next 15 years, they, just keeping to energy, but there's a lot more, they took it as a matter of course that the United States would control Middle East oil. They don't discuss that much. And then they say the United States, though it will control Middle East oil, because that's a lever of world control, nevertheless, it itself will rely on what were called more stable Atlantic Basin resources, meaning West African dictatorships in the Western Hemisphere. That's what the U.S. will rely on. Well, what's been going on in Latin America since then significantly threatens that. For the first time in its history, first time since the Spanish colonization, Latin America is moving towards a degree of independence and also a degree of integration. The history of Latin America is very sharply split between a tiny rich elite and huge poverty, and the rich elite, who are have been the only active ones politically, they were oriented towards the colonial power. So that's where they ship their capital. That's where they have their second wealthy homes. Send their kids to school. This whole business. Very little integration internal to Latin America. I mean, even the transportation system shows that. All right, it's beginning to change. They're moving towards a degree of independence and towards a degree of integration. And the United States is terrified. Just keeping to oil alone, it means that the energy resource, the major energy producer in the hemisphere is Venezuela. The U.S. kicked the British out under Wilson, Woodrow Wilson's, it's known as Wilsonian idealism. They kicked the British out as soon as the oil age began because they knew that Venezuela had enormous oil resources. That meant supporting a bunch of utterly brutal dictators, while Venezuela became, by 1928, the leading oil exporter in the world. It's remained very high. Well, Venezuela is now going towards independence, and the United States is frantic. That's why you have this hysteria about Chavez. It's not because he's attacking anyone or anything like that. It's hysteria because he's not following orders. It's kind of like Serbia, but much more serious, because this is a big energy producer. Furthermore, it influences others. The major energy producer in South America, second to Venezuela, is Bolivia. Well, what just happened there? They're moving towards independence as well. And in fact, the whole region from Venezuela down to Argentina is pretty much out of control. Not totally, but pretty much. The U.S. in the past has had two fundamental mechanisms for controlling Latin America. One is violence. The other is economic strangulation. They're both weakening. The last exercise of violence was in the year 2002, when in its dedication to democracy promotion, the U.S. supported a military coup to overthrow the elected government of Venezuela. Well, had to back down, for one thing, because there was a popular uprising in Venezuela, but another reason was just the reaction in Latin America, where democracy is taken a lot more seriously than it is in North America and Europe. And people don't think it's amusing anymore to have elected governments overthrown by a military coup. So the U.S. had to back down and turn to subversion instead, which is what's going on now. That's the last major use of violence. Incidentally, the U.S. is preparing for more use of violence. If you take a look at the number of U.S. military personnel throughout Latin America, the military bases, the training of Latin American officers, that's all going up very sharply. In fact, for the first time ever, there are now more U.S. military personnel in Latin America than personnel for the major federal aid organizations. That never happened during the Cold War. Also, military training for Latin American officers, and you know what that means. Military training is being shifted from the State Department to the Pentagon. That's important. The Pentagon, the State Department is under congressional supervision, and there are conditionalities, human rights and democracy conditionalities. They're not imposed very much, but they're there, you know, and they have some effect. You switch it to the Pentagon, there's no controls. Do whatever you want. And the whole region surrounded by bases, and I suspect there will be secessionist movements coming along in Venezuela and Bolivia and possibly Iran. So the military option has by no means been abandoned, but it's nothing like what it was before. I mean, in the past, you just overthrew governments, you know, didn't think twice about it. As for the economic option, that's being lost too. The most dramatic case, perhaps, was Argentina. Argentina was the poster child for the IMF, and following IMF rules, it led to the worst economic disaster in its history, totally collapsed. Then, violating IMF rules radically, they pulled out of it and have had rapid growth. And the international investing community and the IMF, which is a branch of the Treasury Department, couldn't do anything about it, even the refusal to pay debt. And Argentina, in fact, the president of Argentina said, well, we're ridding ourselves of the IMF. That means of U.S. economic strangulation. And worse, he was helped in that by Venezuela, which bought a large part of the debt. Bolivia is probably doing the same, and Brazil had already done it. Well, you know, you rid yourself of the IMF, meaning the Treasury Department. That's seriously weakening the measures of economic strangulation, and it's worse. A lot of these policies are gaining significant popular appeal. I just read a scholarly paper by a very anti-Castro Cuban-American scholar who reports, I don't know where he got it from, that he said about 170,000 Latin Americans have been, in the last couple of years, have been treated in Cuban medical facilities, and most of them restoring sight under Cuban Venezuelan programs where Venezuela pays for it, and people, blind people, others who need medical care in the U.S. dependencies, where they can't get it, of course, are sent to Cuba, where they come back seeing. They were blind, you know. Okay, that has its effects on countries. It's called Operation Miracle. And a lot of, and within Venezuela, you know, as far as, you know, you can like it or hate it, but the interesting question is what Venezuelans think about it. Okay, well, we have good knowledge of that. There's extensive polls taken, Latin American, North American polls, and turns out that the popularity of the government has shot way up in the last, since 1998, and it now is the most popular elected government in Latin America. In fact, in the hemisphere, because this government is not popular. So it's the most popular elected government in Latin America, and it keeps going up. Well, reasons not too obscure, but sure, it's driving the United States berserk. That's why you have the constant hysteria from the government and the media about the terrible things in Venezuela and Bolivia, not just in the United States. The Financial Times, for example, which is, in my opinion, maybe the best newspaper in the world, it had an article on Morales. And the article, I wish I could quote it exactly, but it said something like how he's showing authoritarian and dictatorial and anti-democratic tendencies. What were they? Well, the first was that he nationalized Bolivian gas resources in accord with the will of 95% of the population. So that's a clear sign of an authoritarian, dictatorial, anti-democratic move. The other was that he was adopting some of Chavez's mechanisms and even support for aid for the poor and you know, social welfare and so on. Well, that really proves he's kind of a second Hitler or something. But that's a pretty consistent strain in Western reporting, and you can understand it when you have anticipated that all of this is going to remain under your control, so you don't have to worry about it, and then you begin to lose it. That's problematic.